Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Insight Podcast. So, South Korea's political landscape has just taken a huge turn. On the 3rd of June, voters headed to the polls and delivered a significant victory for Lee Jae-myung, leader of the Democratic Party, who now holds a majority and has just begun forming his cabinet. So Lee is entering office with ongoing court cases hanging over him, and seemingly a pretty bold economic strategy. This recent snap election and Lee Jae-myung's win is, of course, coming off the back of the former president Yoon Suk-yeol's declaration of martial law late last year, which came with some pretty dramatic scenes, and then a subsequent backlash followed by Yoon's impeachment, and now this recent victory from Lee Jae-myung. So to unpack all of this, I'm joined by two intelligence analysts from our Asia Pacific desk. We've got Jonah Kaplan, principal analyst on the Asia Pacific desk, and Sophie Hanck, intelligence analyst for the East Asia and Pacific region. So let's start with Jonah. First off, just take us through what exactly happened June 3rd elections. Why are these results so significant, and kind of what stood out most to you in this vote?
Thanks, Sam. Sure, the 3rd of June election was the culmination of 6 months of political instability triggered by the martial law declaration that you mentioned earlier on 3rd of December. The martial law was revoked, and then there proceeded to be a long discussion about the status of the president, Yoon Suk-yeol. He was impeached by the National Assembly, but then the Constitutional Court took several months to make a decision on whether to acquit him or to convict him. Now, there were big protests for and against Yoon, for and against impeachment, which really laid bare the divisions that were in South Korean politics preceding all this political chaos. The election was mandated by the Constitutional Court impeaching Yoon. That had to take place within 2 months, and that took place on 3rd of June. The two main candidates were Lee Jae-myung from the Democratic Party, so that's a sort of left-leaning party, more progressive, and Kim Moon-soo from the People Power Party, which was Yoon's party. Yoon even left the PPP in order to help their chances of winning. Lee was always a strong favourite to win the election because of the backlash against martial law, as you mentioned. What was pretty unprecedented about this election was the turnout. There was a record high turnout, particularly a lot of people voting early, particularly in DP strongholds. And the results showed a comprehensive victory for Lee Jae-myung, with getting 49% of the vote, as opposed to Kim Moon-soo from the People Power Party only getting 41%. So that's a comprehensive victory for Lee. Lee takes office now, and his Democratic Party also has a majority in the National Assembly, which when Yoon was in charge, he was facing a majority of the DP. So now Lee has the majority and the executive. But Lee is an interesting choice as president.
No, for sure. That's he's a really big change for South Korea, not least because his background is pretty interesting. He kind of grew up in poverty, and he was the 5th or 6th of 7 children. He skipped middle school due to hardship, and then he had to start working. When he was a teenager, he suffered permanent injury to his arm because it was crushed in a factory accident. But then he went on to become, a very successful human rights lawyer. He was a human rights lawyer for nearly 20 years before entering politics. He was also a mayor several times. And then he became the Democratic Party's presidential candidate in 2021 and narrowly lost the race in 2022. Lee is also no stranger to scandals and legal issues. We might go a little bit more into that later. But I mean, a really interesting fact about him was that there was an assassination attempt against him in January 2024. I don't know if you remember. So yeah, he was stabbed in the neck by a man. And now when he campaigns in a bulletproof vest, behind bulletproof glass, and he has armed security. So yeah, he's a pretty interesting president for South Korea.
Sophie, while we're on the topic, do you mind just briefly covering some of these controversies, some of these court cases? As a person who doesn't really follow South Korean politics, I kind of assume they had something to do with the martial law kerfuffle, but these go way back. Am I right?
Yeah, so it's true that the legal cases facing Lee Jae-myung were one of the major unknowns heading into his presidency. Um, and while none of these cases have totally vanished, we're now seeing a clear trend from the courts, which is delaying them. So one of the big cases was the election law violation case. This is a case that's basically trying to determine whether Lee is guilty of making false statements during a televised debate in the 2022 presidential campaign. Technically, that's a criminal offense. The appeals court had scheduled a sentencing hearing for mid-June for this case, but that's now been postponed indefinitely. So yes, the conviction still exists, but there's not anymore that sort of legal countdown hanging over Lee for the time being. Another big one is it's a corruption and bribery trial. It stems from when he was a mayor of Songnam City, and it involves alleged collusion with property developers. His case hearing had been scheduled to resume on the 24th of June, so today when we're recording this episode, but that's also now pushed back. And thirdly, and maybe, that's my favorite one because it's the juiciest one. We're talking about allegations that while governor of Gyeonggi province, Lee Jae-myung, or his administration, illicitly transferred millions to North Korean officials. I'm not going to go into all the details, but the bottom line is that this case is very geopolitically sensitive and that it's still active. The next hearing is set for July in Suwon District Court. However, given the direction that the other cases have gone, this could change, and another postponement wouldn't be surprising. So the courts have essentially kind of pressed pause on these cases, and his government isn't under siege from legal chaos, and that kind of gives him space to implement his agenda. But it would be premature to say that the legal troubles have disappeared. They're just kind of on the shelf for now. And that has stirred up some backlash. I think 4 constitutional complaints have already been filed against the delays of these cases, arguing that this infringes on public accountability. So there is definitely a legitimacy debate around these cases. And for now, it hasn't bubbled up too much. But if Lee becomes really unpopular, that could emerge again.
We'll circle back to the cabinet and the National Assembly standing, but I just want to move to the economy really quick. So, Jonah, can we talk about U.S. tariffs? Now that Sophie's given a great kind of outline of who this fella is, how do you think he will handle negotiations with Trump and or pressure from Trump?
Sure, arguably the tariffs are one of the biggest threats to the South Korean economy right now. Lee Jae-myung said in his first speech as president that rising protectionism is a threat to our very survival, which sort of shows how critical they are. The US imposed reciprocal tariffs of 25% on South Korea, but this is only part of the problem because the US also has specific tariffs on automobiles, it has tariffs on steel, and South Korea is a big steel exporter to the US, that these will have a significant impact on South Korea's economy that is highly reliant on these exports to Western markets. The South Korean and US trade representatives met the other day, and they said that they will both intend on working towards a deal of some sort. So South Korea remains a close ally of the US. There is potential room for negotiation. Looking at the sort of the framework with the UK and sort of US trade interests, something around allowing more US beef imports could be one of the parts of the negotiation. But South Korea will very much take the approach of negotiation, trying to relieve itself of some of these tariffs. And because its economy is struggling, it's forecast to grow less than 1% this year and just a little over 1% next year. And for a country with worsening demographics, slowing economy, it really needs to improve trade ties, not just with the US, but across the globe.
Thanks, Jonah. Can you take us through this supplementary budget? What is it, and what kind of impact do you think it might have?
Yeah, so a supplementary budget is a budget on top of the budget. Not quite Liz Truss 2022, but it is a big fiscal stimulus nonetheless. I mean, there was actually a supplementary budget before Lee came in under the sort of interim government before the election, but this is a second one, valued at around $22 billion. That's equivalent to about 14 billion USD additional spending. This is partly sort of to regain trust with the public as well. So there's going to be cash handouts for many people, at least of $110. Now this is also looks to alleviate cost of living pressures, declining domestic consumption, and just sort of to boost the economy. But this is, for South Korea's economy, this is a major investment which will raise debt sustainability issues. That this involves an increased deficit spending, worsening efforts to stabilize the debt in the long term. So this sort of fiscal expansionary policy might help boost the economy in the short term, but will drive some long-term stability risks.
Thanks, Jonah. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about in the pod is going to be foreign policy. But before we get there, let's just circle back here. Sophie, can you walk us through cabinet picks? Give us kind of an overview of who these folks are, and again, in case people aren't familiar with the South Korean political landscape. And are they giving us any signals on where this government is headed, what it's going to look like?
Well, Sam, it's still early days, but yes, I think that his initial cabinet picks are giving a sort of sense about how he intends to run his administration. So one of the most striking appointments in my eyes so far is An Gyu-baek. He's the Minister of National Defense, and he's the first civilian to hold the role in over 6 decades. That's not an accident. After the martial law crisis last year, Lee is clearly looking to restore public trust in the armed forces and reassert civilian oversight over the ministry. Then there's also Chung Dong-young, back at the Ministry of Unification. I'm saying back because he was a former unification minister under the Roh Moo-hyun administration, and he's a known advocate of inter-Korean dialogue. And so with him, engagement is back on the table, but whether it works is another story. And then in terms of labor and business, I think we can cite the naming of Kim Yong-hun to the head of the Labor Ministry. This is symbolic because he was the former president of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, and he's a current train conductor or train engineer, one of the two. But I think that's pretty interesting. So that's a pro-labor pick, which is kind of in line with Lee's historical approach to things. It signals that he'll take labor reforms and union protections seriously. But at the same time, Lee is also signaling to the business community that it's not leaving them by the side of the road. Han Song-suk, who's the Minister of SMEs and Startups, he's the former CEO of Naver, which is a big South Korean tech company. And so that also suggests a pro-business approach as well. So yeah, these are just a few examples, but I think it kind of shows a balancing act of some sort. He's both keeping people from the Yoon administration, I think the agriculture minister is from the Yoon administration, and he's also putting in people that are more on the left wing of Korean politics. He's also balancing between more pro-labor and pro-business interests. So this looks like a pretty pragmatic orientation, in my opinion. Of course, 3 of the big posts are still vacant: finance, justice, and interior. So it's still early days, and we'll really have to keep an eye out for these.
Understood. So far seems like a pretty even keel approach to the cabinet, though. Okay, let's just quickly, before we go to foreign policy, let's just briefly touch on the National Assembly. Do you think we could see him push for some institutional reforms, especially in the wake of the whole martial law debacle? Any changes to big ticket items like the one-term limit, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's start with the facts. Yes, Lee's Democratic Party now holds a commanding majority in the National Assembly, and that could give him more room to maneuver, but there are still challenges. So on the institutional side, yes, constitutional reform is very much back on the agenda, but that is something that all candidates had campaigned on, not just Lee. But basically, the backdrop here that you mentioned is important. The impeachment of Yoon Suk-yeol reignited calls to rethink the structure of the executive branch. Basically, under South Korea's current constitution, which was last revised at the end of the 80s, there is a limit to presidencies to a single 5-year term, as you were saying. So Lee's proposed constitutional package wants to decentralize executive power. He wants to move to a 4-year, 2-term presidency, and that would start in 2030. Then he wants to give the National Assembly the power to nominate the prime minister. That shifts more power towards the legislature. And then he also wants to limit martial law powers and presidential vetoes. And that is a direct response to the crisis that unfolded under Yoon. So what's key here as well is that Lee has publicly committed to serving just 1 term, as the current constitution stipulates. So even if the presidency is restructured, he wouldn't benefit directly from the change. But even with his party's majority, amending the constitution will not be something that is easily done. It requires support from 2/3 of the National Assembly and a public referendum as well. I was looking at polls, and a recent Gallup Korea poll from April showed that 67 of the respondents supported constitutional reform. So the public mood is broadly in favor of this. But Lee wants to delay the constitutional referendum until 2028, and this is meant to give him time to build consensus around this idea. But at the same time, it also kind of risks losing momentum as time goes by. So whether the gamble pays off depends a lot on how well Lee navigates the presidency over the next few years.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sophie. Okay, let's turn to foreign policy, and I want to start with North Korea. So, Jonah, we saw South Korea recently halting its loudspeaker broadcasts at the North Korean border. Can you explain a little bit what that means? Why is that such a big deal?
Yeah, it's funny. These sort of border issues are quite significant. And there's a long history of both sides doing loudspeaker broadcasts into each other's country with propaganda, or South Korea playing K-pop in order to sort of show the North Koreans what they're missing out on. And there's also sort of dropping of leaflets, which occurred last year, which Yoon permitted. So South Korea literally dropping leaflets onto North Korea, propaganda, which North Korea retaliated to by sending over balloons filled with rubbish, including into Seoul. And the stopping of the loudspeaker broadcasts that were permitted under Yoon is a sign that South Korea wants to de-escalate tensions. Inter-Korea tensions have been significantly elevated over the past year or so, particularly with North Korea abandoning unification as one of its constitutional obligations, and considering South Korea a foreign hostile country, as well as notably North Korea strengthening ties with Russia, sending huge amounts of ammunition to Russia, even sending troops to the front line in Kursk Oblast. This strengthens North Korea's hand and got South Korean policymakers worried. Yoon Suk-yeol took the approach of let's challenge North Korea militarily, let's ramp up military drills with the US and with Japan, but and this is the way we're gonna stop North Korea attacking us. Say, if you do something, if you hit us, we're gonna hit you much harder. Whereas Lee Jae-myung, but particularly his party, the Democratic Party, traditionally believes in engagement with North Korea, essentially by talking to North Korea, by throwing some carrots of cooperation. That would be a best way to tame the beast, essentially, and to stop North Korea taking major action. So this is an early sign that Lee Jae-myung will adopt a policy more of engagement and less provocations, which to an extent might ratchet down tensions.
Awesome. Thank you. How about some of the other Asia-Pacific countries, particularly China and Japan? Any changes to South Korea's foreign policy on those fronts?
Yeah, China, there's a lot of continuity. China is the main trading partner of South Korea. South Korea, while it's a close ally with the US, with over 20,000 American soldiers based there, it still values close economic ties with China. So any South Korean president, including Lee, since he's coming to power, emphasizes the importance of dialogue with China, win-win cooperation, boosting trade links, engagement with Chinese President Xi Jinping. These are all things that are likely to come without in any way impacting its security and strategic relationship with the US. One growing concern, which I think sort of is shared by both parties in South Korea, is China's increasingly assertive behavior in the Yellow Sea, which is the sea between the two countries, putting more naval assets there, or oil tankers, that is seen as a provocation. So in regard to China, that could be an area of conflict, and that there are long lingering tensions between the two countries that could easily flare up. In regard to Japan is an interesting one because South Korea and Japan traditionally have a lot of historical baggage, you could say, with South Korea being colonized by Japan, and there's issues about in World War II, comfort women, and in South Korea's view, a lack of remorse expressed by Japan. And this is a big issue of Lee Jae-myung has talked about, a lot of South Koreans talk about. But under Yoon Suk-yeol, South Korea took a bold decision, which is we're going to separate our historical issues from the need to strategically cooperate. Because South Korea and Japan both have close ties with the US and believe that strengthening US ties and having that US nuclear deterrent is the core of their defense strategy and of their foreign policy. So it actually makes sense on that pure geopolitical realism level for the three countries to work together. But there was historical issues that were in the way. So Yoon decided, let's put that aside and let's work together. And this culminated in 2023 in the Camp David Accords in the US, facilitated by former President Joe Biden, between the three countries to work closer together. And this involves military cooperation and drills. Now, Lee Jae-myung is more critical of that. Historically, might not have got into such an agreement, but coming into the presidency now, in his campaign, presenting himself as pragmatic and conservative in some ways, he's moderated his position towards Japan a bit. Since coming to power, he's spoken to Ishiba. Ishiba and Lee met at the G7 in Canada, and they both talked about their inseparable relationship. So there's a lot of potential for them to continue cooperating, especially in the economic sphere, which is far less controversial. But overall, I would still say, compared to where South Korea was a year ago, the level of military cooperation, at the very least, is not going to continue at the same pace. It's not going to expand as much, and there may be limited, and there may be more room for disputes or issues in the relationship. And also worth noting that Japan, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, is also pretty weak without a parliamentary majority, and will struggle to sell such cooperation with South Korea to the domestic audience, given the current climate. So the trilateral relationship is still there, but the three countries aren't going to work as closely as they did under Yoon.
Understood. Yeah, more isolationism, which is kind of a theme, I guess, around the world at the moment. I've got one last question for both of you. It's a curveball. But before we do that, Sophie, do you have anything to add on the foreign policy front?
No, I think I really agree with Jonah. You know, China, Japan, and South Korea is just such a complicated relationship. China and South Korea kind of join in historical trauma vis-a-vis Japan, and Japan and South Korea experiencing some form of maritime dispute with China. And so, yeah, even though there's this intention on all sides to cooperate because they're just such important trade partners, there's always these flare-ups that emerge to keep it interesting, at least for us analysts.
Okay, so to close out here, I just wanted to see if you guys have any thoughts on South Korea's position with the recent escalation in the Middle East. Specifically, I'm curious to know if you would see any huge impacts should the Strait of Hormuz be impacted in any way. And if there's something I'm not thinking of, if there's another way that South Korea could be impacted by that. Yeah. Love to hear it.
Yeah, so South Korea is very reliant on oil imports. I think it purchases nearly all the oil it consumes. So definitely, if there is some blockade happening in Hormuz, that could severely impact South Korea's energy security.
Yeah, and it's affected, but it's not necessarily so influential in this one. I mean, Lee's decided to not go to the NATO summit in The Hague this week, to dealing with other priorities. It's clear that the US is sort of leading on this front. But I think what one major concern would be, and this goes with every sort of international crisis, about with a vacuum or sort of leadership, if there's a distraction, is China going to take some major action in the Taiwan Strait or in the Yellow Sea? This is South Korea is still very Asia Pacific focused, and we'll be looking to see if there's any provocations there.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for coming on today to explain this new South Korean president to us. I know your desks are both working very hard on cranking out reports around this topic, I'm sure. If folks would like, please get in touch with us, info@sibylline.co.uk. We are offering free trials to our WRR, where you can read Sophie and Jonah's analysis, as well as analysis from the rest of their desk, and indeed all of our regional desks. But for now, take care, you two, and I hope to see you again on the next episode.